Well, another Monday morning is here. I'm glad you guys could stop by. This is a little deal about, well, it's kind of a war story thing. But I start out with, I got a couple of them working on here. And one of the things that I've mentioned in here before is how sometimes it's surprising if you just check the price at the dealer, you'll be surprised that you can save money there. Most recently I was going to do an oil change on my Explorer, and I went to the local Advanced Auto Parts, and he wanted like, I think it was $8 or $9 for the fuel filter, the oil filter, and I called the Ford place standing right there, and all they wanted was $6 and some change. So, you don't assume you're going to get the best prices at the local part store, but in a lot of cases you won't if that same part is available at the dealer. Now, sometimes you do get better prices, but you also got to consider where the part's made and the country of origin, if you know what I'm saying. Well, this Taurus of mine, I mentioned this story a time or two, but I gave it a little more detail this time. This belt tensioner one morning just broke without warning, and so I go to the part store because it's a Saturday, and I buy one of these. The guy wanted at the time at the part store like 70, like nearly $80 for it. And I said, well, that sounds kind of pricey, but let's just go ahead and see if we can get this thing going again. So I paid $80 for the thing, came back home, put it on it, and seemed like everything was all right. But I just dropped by the Ford dealer the next time I was over there a couple of days later when they were open, and he said, I said, well, if I just walked in off the street and bought one of these, it would be $55. And so I got him to print that, and I took it back to the part store, and I had him printed me this estimate on the cost of this. And I said, what can you do for me on this? Because I had my receipt and everything. He's, well, that place is selling those for less than I pay for them, so I can't help you with that. They're supposed to price match. But anyway, there was another time way back in the in the early 80s when I was working on a Volkswagen Bug, and the guy there was a little parts house over here that had recently opened that belonged to a guy that I had gone to school with. And I went in there and I said, I need a set of, I didn't want to have to drive all the way to the big town where I usually bought my parts. So I came into his little part store and I said, hey, I need a set of points for a 67 Volkswagen Bug. And he threw a set of World Part points on the counter with a plastic rubbing block, and they were just, not very good. He said, $3.11. I said, goodness, Steve, you're getting rich off these things. He goes, I don't make no more than 15% off anything I sell. And I said, well, you're paying too much for them then, because I can buy the original equipment Bosch points down at the parts house, in the big town for 65 cents. And then he sputtered and he says, that guy's ruining the parts business for everybody. He's selling them for what I pay for them. And I was thinking, that sure blew that 15% thing out of the water, didn't it? Anyway, the cheap parts can actually cost you money. I've seen all these front end parts that I've seen that would be look really good, feel good in your hand, cost $17. You put like an idler arm for a Chevy pickup, for example. You put the thing on there and 2 weeks later it's worn out. I'm not kidding. I've seen this a couple of times with them cheap $17 idler arms. You get a good one that's going to cost you 70, 80 bucks. You got to put a good one on there. You won't have to put it, probably won't ever need to change it again unless you drive the truck another 150,000 miles. Well, that's what we were looking at here. And I actually, for a different vehicle, it wasn't the same tensioner, but it was a tensioner on another vehicle. This is the Dayco tensioner, this is the Gates tensioner, and this is the OEM tensioner. The problem with the Taurus was it had 180,000 on it when I replaced that tensioner, and right after that I sold it to my son, and he was working at a tire store at the time. And so he was noticing that the belt was squealing, and so he said, as soon as I sprayed a little silicone on it, the belt jumped off. And I went and looked, and that Dayco tensioner I had put on there was out of line. And after that, for years, I would see, now I don't know how Dayco is now. I'm not hating on Dayco necessarily because I use their belts and stuff. But that those tensioners would pull out a line, and that's something a tensioner doesn't need to do. You need that thing lined up perfectly. And the gates typically would stay like that. So I typically I'm gonna shy away from Dayco tensioners. Their other stuff may be okay, but I just never have really cared for a Dayco belt tensioner. Now the stuck open thermostat on this 2004 Sebring originally came in. We replaced this thermostat for a P0125 code, and we, with more than a few occasions when I was at a Ford place even, and I would draw a thermostat. And this didn't happen every time, but in one particular time I remember I drew a thermostat because of a cold running engine, swapped it out, bled it out, and it ran cold. And I had to keep getting another and another and another thermostat. And finally I got the right thermostat, and the thing was, running as hot as it was supposed to. So, thermostats are wonky anyway, they can be. Sometimes it's because of the spring gets weak. Sometimes, I don't know if something goes wrong with the wax element or whatever. Whenever I was early in this business back in the 70s, thermostats would stick closed. It seemed like that's the ones we saw, because the ones that stuck open, the car just ran cooler, and everybody really liked that back then. Of course, if the car is running cooler, it tends to sludge the engine up, and they didn't have a clue that the thermostat was causing that because it was stuck open, or wasn't working at all, just wide open, letting the coolant flow all the time. And a cool engine, the emission system doesn't work as good on a cool engine, and there's all kinds of reasons you don't want your engine running too cool. It needs to run around 200 degrees or slightly over that. As a matter of fact, I may have mentioned this before, but the cooling fan on some of the Chevrolet Cavaliers, it wasn't supposed to kick on until 228. And on those little Ford Escorts, we used to get people that were scared to death because the cooling fan wouldn't come on until it was getting up on the higher end of the scale. And they were always worried about it overheating. Of course, in a lot of cases, that's something you can't come back from. But you can see this one here is stuck. Incidentally, when you see these little dongle things up here and dancing around in a hole, that lets the air out of it. You put your thermostat in there. If it's mounted vertically, you put that up so that the air can get out of there while you're filling the cooling system. That's the whole reason that thing's there. Sometimes it'll have a little seat with a ball in it or something like that. But one way or another, this thermostat here was stuck open. That was what I was illustrating with that picture. All right, so the 2.7 is an engine I had put in released a YouTube video for a while back about a 2.7, and some guys, wrote me, and he says, I just bawl and squall and cry every time one of those comes into my service bay because I despise those engines, Well, they're crammed in this convertible. All of the Sebring convertibles had a 2.7 in them. A lot of the Sebrings that weren't convertibles would have the little 2.4 4-cylinder, and it fit a lot better in there. It wasn't crammed, slam full. Furthermore, the water pump on this one is inside. See, that's the dadgum water pump right there, and it's driven by the timing chain. Now, if the water pump leaks, well, I'll talk about that on the next slide. And so, I'm basically, one of the things I needed to remember when I was working as an instructor, and we were doing all this live work so the students could learn, the objective was partially for them to fix the car, but other part of it was for them to learn how to fix it. You see, if I had to hold their hand all the way through every job, they weren't really learning much of anything. But we replaced the thermostat, warmed it up one time. He came back 3 months later, he said, it's running cold again. And I said, well, fiddle faddle, so I said, okay, I gave this job to a boy named Andrew. I said, we need to go ahead and replace this thermostat. Well, this one here is mounted behind the AC compressor, so you need to really pull the AC compressor off when you change it. And the reason for that is that place where that thermostat bolts up is on the side of the block, and that block is aluminum, and that place on that block is not that thick, and you got little 6mm 1/0 threads in there. Now this here's your water pump weep passage, so they did a good thing. Ford didn't do this with the ones they have that's got the water pump built inside the motor. They just let it go into the motor and fill the crankcase up with water. But Chrysler was pretty darn smart here. They've got a little weep hole right here where if you see water dripping out from by the thermostat, that means you got water pump issues. If this hole happens to be stopped up, there is another one in the center of the valley where it'll run down the valley and it'll go out some holes in the back and drip off around the transmission housing. So it won't ever go, they've got it fixed where it can't ever get into the crankcase. It's going to go out, but it may go out in places you wouldn't expect if you're just looking at a water pump issue. All right, and so he went ahead and tried to do the job without taking the air conditioner compressor off. Said he didn't like the way the bolt felt, so he was going to put a tap in there. Still didn't take the air conditioner compressor off. Broke the tap off in the block, just smooth as silk. And I drilled like this. I was going to have to enlarge the hole anyway, so I drilled the hole, drilled 4 holes. And then you can turn this just a little bit and rattle it out, past them holes. And then you run a 1/4 inch bit in there, and that's the size you got to use for helicoil anyway. Anybody that's ever put a helicoil in knows that. Now, the tool that you put the helicoil in is not as illustrated in this little thing I put up here. But this is what it looked like after we were done. We managed to fix it, and so we had a good helicoil in here, and these were good threads, and this was good threads. But you could not leave that bolt out because it was going to leak. This was a car killer. What was going to happen is if you couldn't fix that hole, you couldn't drive the car because it wouldn't hold coolant. I mean, and this was one little tiny incident that can cause the whole job to go south. Just like sometimes whenever you've got one little situation where you need like a banjo bolt with a certain thread that you don't have because somebody twisted it off and you got to order it and it takes 2 days to get it. That car's dead in the water until it gets here and they can't drive it like that. If you can't get a banjo bolt, you're just about going to make one or something. Well, we also noticed the blower, the engine warmed up like it was supposed to, but the blower wasn't working. We were checking for cabin heat. It wouldn't work all the time. We found, this is the new pigtail. We found a pigtail that was on the blower all scorched and burnt and everything. If the connector tabs in the where these the male ones plug into these, if it's all scorched and messed up, you're going to have to do something about those too. Probably replace the blower. Usually that's what we would do, but anyway, we got the blower going again. Well, the gauge was lying to us. We were measuring it with a scan tool. I use this ease diagnostic interface where I could put the engine coolant picture way up on a big screen where you could watch it the whole time you were running the motor and all. And it would keep on going up and up and up and up and up and up. Well, the thing about it is the PCM talks to the, well, I'll have a schematic of that anyway. If you ever run into a situation where you know you got it full of coolant and the fan comes on and it never goes off and it just keeps running and running and running and running, then you know you got issues. This one didn't have any fan operation. The fan wouldn't work, which you would explain why it was getting hot. And so I said, okay, well, the fan's never kicking on. And it was reading right here, even though it was reading really hot on the scan tool screen, which is getting its information from the same place. All right, it reminded me of a New Yorker though that I piddled with, or somebody called me to look at, and you can loosen that bleeder up there, which was right here, and this thing would immediately start making air and pushing air out, and I would have sworn that was a head gasket or something. But the guy that owned it said he was going to try a thermostat, and he did. That took care of it. It's all it needed. Now, how it made air so fast, I'm not exactly sure. But the long and the short of it was the gauge never showed hot on that one either. See, so I was beginning to wonder, can you trust these gauges anyway? If it's got an air bubble right there at the bulb where the sending unit takes its information, you don't know anyway. I mean, the gauge is not accurate. Well, this right here is a lot of hardware in between the coolant temp sensor and the gauge on the dash. The coolant temp sensor talks to the PCM. PCM on the PCI bus sends this to the body control. PCI bus then leaves the body control going to the instrument cluster computer, and the instrument cluster computer is the one that operates the coolant temperature gauge. See, so there's a lot of middlemen in here. I never have really liked that, but just about every vehicle out there is set up this way now. You're going to have a computer in the instrument cluster. This is the way it used to be. The coolant temp sensor went straight to the gauge. No middleman. Those things were very good. If you wanted to test it, all you had to do was take this wire loose, unplug it from the gauge, short it to ground, see if the gauge goes to hot. Now, that is just brilliant the way it was. Now, the specs on the Chrysler fan, the fan was supposed to come on at 220, off at a 208. High fan would come at 230, off at 221. See, if you can get those numbers and you can watch your scan tool, you can even hook your potentiometer up and dial those numbers in. If you hook your potentiometer up with the engine coolant sensor, and you can test it without heating the engine up that way. And I used to love to do that. Well, this Montana, I've shown this before, but it's just funny as all get out. I mean, this needle is waggling all over the place. But on this one here, the PCM directly over the class 2 signal line communicates with this antenna cluster and tells it what to do with the needle. You see that needle waggling around all over the place. It goes down, it goes up, and watching it here. See how it's just moving? I didn't speed up something. This is what it looked like it go down. Well, on the back to the Sebring, I says let's look and see if we got power at the fan relays. So here's the low fan relay, and here's the high fan relay, and here's the fuse. Right. All right. So what we did was we went ahead and checked the power at the common terminal. No power there. Now, if the fan is supposed to be turned on and the circuit's energized to these relays, you ought to have 2 grounds and 2 powers. 2 grounds because one side's going to be the ground for the coil, the other side will be a ground coming back through the component. The 2 powers would be, of course, on most relays, actually the ground comes from the switch that's switching it. So, you're going to have power to the other side of the coil. But one way or another, we had no power here. And when we pull that fuse out, and I've showed this picture before because this is really important to remember, this fuse was not blown, but it had overheated because of the current flow from the fan. Because the fan starts to heat this thing up, oxidizes it, and we used to have Ford vans that would, with the glass fuses in them, that would actually melt the glass fuse. Without blowing the fuse, it would melt the solder out of the glass fuse, and the fan would quit working. And we had to put circuit breakers on those. Well, this particular one here, since it didn't have any power here or here, we found out why it didn't have any power, because that fuse is right here, and it's what feeds power, all of that stuff. All right, so anyway, fans usually pull about 10 to 15 amps a piece, and that kind of current, fan motors are the most common place where you see failures like this, either in the connector or in the fuse or in the relay or something like that. So we cleaned the contacts as good as we could with some valve grinding compound, sandpaper, cleaned them off and everything. They added a little dielectric grease which keeps the oxygen away from those terminals so it doesn't oxidize. If you can coat that thing with a little bit of grease, that's why so many tail lights come with this dielectric grease in there around them. It won't all look the same. Some of it's a soft, pasty looking stuff. The newer vehicles that's got those little wedge type plug-in lights, they don't ever have dielectric grease. But sometimes, if you notice, the bulb's not blown but the light's not working unless you tap it. That's because there's only a tiny little bit of contact between that wire and the thing it touches in there. So it's not a bad idea to put just a little smidge of dielectric grease on those too, because that insulates it. It makes the current flow only where they're touching, and it keeps any oxygen from getting in there. Well, on this time, we had the fans fixed. They came on, but they always kept running, and it kept getting hotter. So this is another problem. We've still got a problem. See how this thing will throw you if you've got more than one problem that's pointing in the same direction? The upper and lower hose temperatures with the stuck thermostat. Remember, the lower hose hooks to the thermostat housing on this one. The upper hose actually hooks to the little bleeder assembly up there, but there's no thermostat under that. And the upper hose was reading 182 when we were checking it before we let it get too hot. And the lower hose was still reading just 83 because the thermostat was closed and it wasn't letting the hot water out of the block to go to the radiator. And so that Chinese thermostat that they sent us had failed. I like to use a Stant thermostat if I can, because they're usually the best, or the OEM brand. Bleeding the cooling system. This takes a 3/8 wrench, or it did on that one, which it seems to me like it ought to be a 10 millimeter, so they'll throw you for a loop thinking you know what size you're going to need. But whenever you open this screw, you pour the coolant in without the engine running. Open that screw, pour it in until all of the air is pushed out through here, and then you start to see coolant, then you close that off. You notice they got it made like a brake bleeder, where you can run a hose into a jug if you don't want to spill coolant all over the top of the engine. Tell you something else about these housings here. These houses can crack and leak and make a whole lot of coolant run back through the valley and dribble off the transmission and make you think you got a whole pile of bad freeze plugs or something. So just be aware of the fact that if you've got one of these 2.7s that's developed a big coolant leak that's dripping out around the transmission bell housing, check this first before you do a bunch of other work. You can buy these at the parts store. They'll typically come with a sensor, and they usually cost from 30 to 60 bucks or something like that. They may be more than that now. This 96 Explorer quit while driving. It's another gauge story. This lady's gauge was telling her she had 3/4 of a tank of gas, and she wanted to believe that, so she just kept driving it. And then she called me and says, "Hey, my vehicle's over here close to your shop and it has quit." And she was on the way to the town that was 15 miles past us from where she started. And I went over there and I hooked up, put the meter on amps and moved this lead from here up to here, and then went and pulled the relay, and I went from the power terminal to the one going out to the pump. And when I did that, I only read 1.5 amps. And basically what that meant was she was out of gas and didn't know it. If it's got gas in it, it's going to be pulling 6 to 8 amps. Some of the Crown Victorias might pull 4. But if that pump is spinning without moving fuel, it's not going to pull very many amps. I don't know if you've ever noticed it or not, but if you've got a vacuum cleaner, that's one of these little handhelds, and you put your hand over the end of that vacuum cleaner, the motor picks up speed. And the reason it does that is because it's not having to work as hard because it's spinning in a vacuum. There's no air for it to pull. That's the same way with a fuel pump. This Civic had lousy AC performance. This came in about the same time. Alright, so we found blended juice in there, 23% R134, and the rest of it was R12. So we pull that out with a dedicated machine into the yellow bottle with the gray top, and then we put the right amount of juice back in there, but the AC clutch was just going bap, 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 like a machine gun. And the reason for that was the fuse, see, it's got a regular little fuse here that's feeding that, going down there, and that was the whole problem, to feed the fan. And so this one here, I think in the Canadian models it has a higher 20 amp fuse, and in the Americans is like 15 for some strange reason. But one way or another, we had to clean these terminals up the best we could. Don't spread them out. You got to clean them up and put a new fuse in there and a little dielectric grease, And so then you wind up, we got that one fixed and straightened out. Now this is a trick I used to do because people were always coming by my bench borrowing my gasket glue. And so we were using round oil cans back then, if anybody can even remember that, watching this. And I cut the bottom out of a round oil can. It was a nasty old grubby oil can. It looked terrible. And I set it over that as camouflage. And nobody knew where my gasket glue was, so they quit borrowing it. I would also take my can of carburetor spray and I would make a fake label that said liquid manure, do not use, and they wouldn't touch that. But if they could see that it was carburetor spray, they'd grab it and run off with that too. Everybody wants to grab stuff off your bench, But that's all I got for you today. We've been talking 23 minutes. I hope you had got something out of this, and enjoy your week, and be careful out there. See you next time.